Welcome to Lone Star Gun Talk, ladies and gentlemen. This is Derek Wills, and I am happy to be here as always. As I closed last week's show, I just wanted to remind everybody that next week I will have Phil King on the show to have a back and forth dialogue regarding constitutional carry, a little bit of what happened last session. But again, I'm not going to delve too deeply into what happened last session. It's just going to be a Q&A, and then I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. Delving too deeply into it is not going to change what happened. I'm just hoping that he can shed some light, and if it's a good reason or not, at least give him the chance to explain it. And then focus on moving forward, what constitutional carry should look like next session, what we would like to see enacted, and all that fun stuff. So that's my goal. Just want to let you know and remind you that next week Phil King will be on the show, and I'm super excited to have him on. This week, I have a very interesting couple articles that I want to read, one of which comes out of Niagara Falls, where an Iraq veteran was convicted of 3 felony weapons charges for the mere possession of 3 17-round magazines. Simeon Makaber was driving his car on April 18th, 2016, and he was stopped for speeding. He was charged with driving while intoxicated and was hit with the weapons charges after the police found 3 17-round magazines for a Glock handgun in his vehicle. Makaber did not have a weapon in the vehicle, and he was a licensed pistol permit holder. But despite this, he was arrested and charged with this. On April 21st of this year, a jury acquitted him of DWI, but later convicted him on the 3 weapons charges as well as the speeding charge. Now, this whole story generated a public outcry of sorts, and there were several defenders that raised over $3,000 for him, and a petition for leniency in sentencing had over 1,500 signatures on it. In fact, during sentencing, the judge in the case had to move the sentencing to a larger courtroom because so many people had shown up in support of him. Now, I'm not entirely sure. This article doesn't say exactly what the sentence was, but it says that it's a conditional discharge, and I'm not quite sure what that means. He does have the conviction on his record, and his lawyer is saying that they are going to appeal it as high as they can to get the conviction overturned. But the fact that he was arrested and charged with felonies, and later convicted of felonies for the mere possession of something, is about as asinine as you can get. This is kind of the crux of the whole argument whenever it comes to constitutional carry. It's that the possession of the firearm isn't indicative of your motives. This is the same kind of argument that I make as it relates to background checks. You can have a clean background, but that's not indicative of your future motives. Just as you can have a felony charge on your background, and that's not indicative of what your motives are going to be. I view this as a very similar aspect. Many people, all gun rights advocates, should be outraged that somebody got a felony charge and conviction for the mere possession of high capacity or standard capacity magazines, however you want to phrase it. And I would perfectly be okay with that. But a lot of people also feel that background checks are perfectly okay, and I kind of see this as the same thing. These types of laws were passed, and I'm talking about the magazine laws. They were passed as a method of saying that nobody would ever need more than 10 rounds or 15 rounds or whatever it is. Because if you do need more than that, then your motives must be malicious in some way. And I relate this perfectly back to the background check thing. You don't have to have a bad background or a dirty background in order to have malicious intent. There are plenty of people, plenty of examples out there throughout American history where somebody would have completely passed a background check. Namely, the most recent example is in Las Vegas. Completely passed a background check without any issues and legally obtained firearms for the sole purpose of killing or harming others. And I can also flip that coin around and say somebody who has paid their debt to society, who has served their time and completed their parole, can simply want to possess a firearm to protect himself and his property. One thing that's interesting about this case, going back to the Niagara Falls case, is that this was not a provision of the New York SAFE Act. The ban on magazines with a capacity of over 10 rounds took effect back in 1994. So he would have been convicted or at least charged with this prior, had the SAFE Act never gone into effect. What the SAFE Act did do as it related to magazine capacity is there used to be a grandfather clause in the old ban law that said that if you bought your high capacity or whatever terminology they use, if you bought your magazines prior to the bill going into effect, you were fine. Well, the SAFE Act ended that. That said, though, I'm pretty sure that he probably acquired his magazines after that date. Although he is 42 years old, so I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, I hope that his appeals come in his favor. I won't know. We won't know for quite some time. This story just came out October 27th. So I'll keep an eye on it, but I don't see any news coming from this anytime soon. And it's interesting, though, that a lot of people, a lot of gun control advocates, think that this sort of thing is just. And it's not. You're sending people to prison or jail or, at minimum, giving them a felony conviction for the mere possession of something that has nothing to do with anything whatsoever. As I said in the article, he did not have a weapon in his car. All he had were the magazines. The magazines aren't going to shoot anything by themselves, period. And even if he had a weapon in there, the weapon's not going to shoot anything by itself. It requires an operator to be behind the trigger and to squeeze that trigger and operate the firearm. You can do that lawfully, you can do that illegally, you can do that maliciously, you can do that in any number of ways. And it all boils down to what your motives are, what is in your heart. To criminalize the possession of something is not justice, because it does not, it is in no way indicative of what is in your heart. It is no way indicative of the motives that you have. And it really rubs me the wrong way that gun control advocates say that this is perfectly in line with the Second Amendment, even though they know that's BS. But that kind of leads me to my next story that I wanted to cover, and I'm going to spend some time on this because it's quite humorous. It's from our lefty friends over at Salon.com, and if you want hours of entertainment, I would say that reading some Second Amendment or even historic articles written and published on Salon.com, it's the best bang for your buck, for your entertainment dollar that you can get, because it's free. So I stumbled upon this article with the headline, 5 Types of Gun Laws the Founding Fathers Loved. And I had to read it because I knew that it was going to be highly entertaining, and it proved to be. And it opens up by saying, the Second Amendment is one of the most frequently cited provisions in the American Constitution, but also one of the most poorly understood. The 27 words that constitute the Second Amendment seem to baffle modern Americans, both on the left and on the right. Ironically, those on both ends of our contemporary political spectrum cast the Second Amendment as a barrier to robust gun regulation. Gun rights supporters, mostly, but not exclusively on the right, seem to believe that the Second Amendment prohibits many forms of gun regulation. On the left, frustration with the lack of progress on modern gun control leads to periodic calls for the amendment's repeal. Both of these beliefs ignore an irrefutable historic truth. The framers and adopters of the Second Amendment were generally ardent supporters of the idea of a well regulated liberty. I'm sorry, but there is no such thing as well regulated liberty. Regulation, by its very definition, is a means of control. Control is the antithesis of liberty. So you cannot say well-regulated liberty. That's an oxymoron. You can't, it is it's like calling somebody an intelligent Hillary supporter or an intelligent Bernie supporter. It doesn't work. But he goes in, or I assume it's a he. I could be wrong. I don't want to assume this person's gender. Uh, it goes in and lists, let's see here, 4, 5 different areas in which the founders wanted and demanded regulations on the carrying of arms. And the first one is registration. Wow, I didn't know that the founding fathers wanted registration because we haven't registered any sorts of firearms until 1934. So I don't see this as a viable argument, but let's see what he has to say. Today, American gun rights advocates typically oppose any form of registration, even though such schemes are common in every other industrial democracy. Well, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic, but okay. And typically argue that registration violates the Second Amendment. Well, it does, but let's see what else they say. All of the colonies, except for Pennsylvania, enrolled local citizens, white men between the ages of 16 and 60, in state-regulated militias. The colonies and the newly independent states kept track of these privately owned weapons required for militia service. Men could be fined if they reported to muster without a well-maintained weapon in working condition. This is them trying to twist the well-regulated definition. And, I've never really liked that argument to begin with because it has no bearing on the Second Amendment. The whole a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state portion, it's a justification. It's not a legal mandate by any stretch. It is merely the justification as to why the operative clause is there. But what's funny is it says that they use these to track privately owned weapons required for malicious or for the militia service. That's not actually registration. They did not track the serial numbers and who they went to and things like that. They wanted to make sure that the weapon that you took to muster was in proper working condition, as this article also says. However, the whole subheading that this falls under is in support of mandatory registration with the government of the firearm type, serial number, and how many you own for all weapons. This is nowhere near the case as it related to the militias. They wanted to keep track of the arms that you had for the militia, specifically for the militia, and making sure that they were properly working, as well-regulated actually meant back then. However, this has nothing to do with one or the other. It's like comparing apples and igloos. It just doesn't work. So number 2 is quite funny. It says public carry. Apparently, the founding fathers opposed the idea of carrying a firearm in public on your person. And it says, the modern gun rights movement has aggressively pursued the goal of expanding the right to carry firearms in public. Yes, absolutely. Could not agree with that statement anymore. The American colonies inherited a variety of restrictions that evolved under English common law. In the 18th century England, now we're talking about England because we didn't go to war with them because we loved everything that they did. In 18th century England, armed travel was limited to a few well-defined occasions such as assisting justices of the peace and constables. Members of the upper classes also had limited exception to travel with arms. because the elites must be the only ones who carry arms because let's face it, they're the only ones that should be allowed to protect themselves because after all, they're elite, they're wealthy. But this kind of goes against the whole top 1% argument that they want, right? I mean, I'm just saying, I'm not an expert here or anything like that. Concealable weapons such as handguns were subject to even more stringent restrictions. The city of London banned public carry of these weapons entirely. Well, again, this is London. We're talking about colonial America, revolutionary America here. Things were completely different. Keep in mind, we went to war, or we were ready to go to war over a 3% tax on a breakfast beverage, and ultimately went to war because they were coming to confiscate our firearms. But let's not let actual history get in the way of this, right? The American Revolution did not sweep away English common law. In fact, most colonies adopted common law as it had been interpreted in the colonies prior to independence, including the ban on traveling armed in populated areas. Thus, there was no right of armed travel when the Second Amendment was adopted, and certainly no right to travel with concealed weapons. Well, let me kind of dissect this just a bit deeper. The author cites an essay on the Duke's Law School website that talks about the adoption of English common law by post-revolutionary America as he did himself. And specifically what he's talking about is some of the provisions set forth by the Crown as it related to traveling with arms. It cites a few different versions of this law, but the one that they're talking about mainly is the Statute of Northampton, which took place in 1328, which is a bit before the discovery of America, let alone America's founding, but I'm just going to go with it. This statute said that no person should, quote, bring no force in a fray of the peace, nor to go nor ride armed with by night or by day. So basically, you cannot travel with arms. This was the statute from 1328. As he's trying to relate it to the post-revolutionary America, he talks about a 1795 Massachusetts statute, and this is what he says. It's quite funny. In 1795, Massachusetts enacted its own version of the Statute of Northampton, drawn from prior English commentators. The law forbade anyone who, quote, shall ride or go armed offensively to the fear or terror of the good citizens of this Commonwealth. Well, that's substantially different, isn't it? The Statute of Northampton said you cannot travel with arms, period, basically. This says you cannot ride offensively in a manner that will bring fear or terror to the citizens. That doesn't say that you can't be armed. It just says that you can't be armed and waving it around like you're going to shoot people. So it's quite laughable that this is how they're tying the right to carry, the constitutional exception of being able to carry while traveling, especially. The next section that's quite laughable is stand your ground laws. And again, it talks about English common law and the duty to retreat while defending yourself. And it says, deadly force was justified only if there was no other alternative possible. One had to retreat until retreat was no longer possible before killing an aggressor. Again, this is English common law. We fought a war against the English, so their laws no longer applied. But the article does admit that the emergence of a more aggressive view of the right of self-defense in public, standing your ground, emerged slowly in the decades after the Civil War. So, nowhere in here does it say that the Founding Fathers actually opposed stand your ground laws. It just said that we didn't actually start to enact them until following the Civil War. So again, so far I'm 3 for 3 at destroying these arguments, which is quite funny. The next one is safe storage laws. Although some gun rights advocates attempt to demonize government power, it is important to recognize that one of the most important rights citizens enjoy is the freedom to elect representatives who can enact laws to promote the health and public safety. This is the foundation of the idea of ordered liberty. There it is again, that phraseology that is an oxymoron. Before it was well-regulated liberty. Now it's ordered liberty. The regulation of gunpowder and firearms arises from the exercise of this basic liberty. In 1786, Boston acted on legal principle, prohibiting the storage of a loaded firearm in any domestic dwelling in the city. Guns had to be kept unloaded, a practice that made sense since black powder used in firearms in this period was corrosive. Loaded guns also posed a particular hazard in cases of fire because they might discharge and injure innocent bystanders and those fighting fires. Well, that actually kind of makes a little bit of sense as good common practice, but I could even give the city of Boston a pass for this, considering that it did pose an actual threat. It would, one, prevent your firearm from being a well-regulated firearm because it would corrode the internals. It would corrode out the chamber and things like that. It would not function properly. But also there was this mentality that a black powder cook-off would be dangerous to those fighting fires. We now know that that's not an issue, especially with today's modern ammunition, the cartridge ammunition, which was not available back then. I'm going to play here some audio from a video that was done firefighter testing, and in this you will hear what sounds like hail, but it's actually a bunch of rounds cooking off in a massive semi-truck fire, and this was done under controlled conditions. And you will hear the commentators talk about how it actually poses no threat to anybody that's fighting a fire. Take a listen.
A firefighter stood in the path of the projectiles and was struck several times with no adverse effect.
I walked up to the fire after it was in full blaze and the ammunition was going off very quickly. And I'd seen that it didn't penetrate sheetrock in previous tests, so I came up and tested out my turnout gear at close range. And I felt being hit many times, but there was no pain sensation or didn't feel very hard.
So there goes that theory on safe weapons keeping practices. Now, we should always keep our weapons in a safe if you can afford one, especially if you have children. But that should not be mandated by law. So this is yet another example of me debunking this guy's gun control laws supported by the founders. The last one is a loyalty oath, which is absolutely laughable. One of the most common claims one hears in the modern Second Amendment debate is the assertion that the founders included this provision in the Constitution to make possible a right of revolution. But this claim, too, rests on a serious misunderstanding of the role the right to bear arms played in American constitutional theory. In fact, the founders engaged in large-scale disarmament of the civilian population during the American Revolution. The right to bear arms was conditional on swearing loyalty oath to the government. Individuals who refused to swear such an oath were disarmed. This is actually a gross misunderstanding of what Madison had actually written as it relates to this. So, a quick history lesson. Yes, in the autobiography of John Adams, dated Thursday, March 14th, 1776, he talks about how he supported a resolution that immediately caused all persons to be disarmed who are notoriously disaffected to the cause of America or who have not associated and shall refuse to associate to defend by arms these united colonies against the hostile attempts of the British fleets and armies, and to apply these arms taken from such persons in each respective colony in the first place into arming the continental troops raised in said colony, blah, blah, blah. Long-winded, but here's basically what it says. And Salon is actually technically right in this. John Adams did favor a resolution that would disarm civilians in... Essentially, these were territories that were very heavy with British influence, not sympathetic to the American Revolution, so to speak. So if they did not commit to fighting for the American cause, then their arms would be seized. But one thing that we have to remember, this is war. And in war, the rules get changed a bit. War is hell, as they say. And this does not mean that what happened was right. It does not mean that it was justified, because I have said 1,000 times that the right to bear arms is a God-given right, not a right given by government. However, in the age where war was actively taking place on American soil, a fight for independence from the British Crown, I can understand this. Again, I'm not supporting it, but I can understand why they would want it. Another thing to note, this was 1776. This was not 1787 when the new Constitution was adopted, nor was it 1791 when the Second Amendment was ratified. So we need to understand that this was a different time. And again, the Constitution does not grant rights, it preserves rights. But it does mean that circumstances can cause, very, very rare circumstances, can be somewhat justified. Again, I'm not supporting what John Adams said, but I am saying that there is somewhat of a justification for that, especially in a time of war, whenever you are seriously a bunch of farmers trying to throw off and fend off the most powerful standing military in the world. I don't think that scenario will ever play out again in global history. So I would say it is the exception rather than the rule. But this goes against the actual point that he's trying to make. He says, again, one of the most common claims is that the founders included this provision in the Constitution to make possible a right of revolution, but this claim too rests on a serious misunderstanding of the role the right to bear arms played. Well, no, not really at all, because going to a different time, fast forwarding to post-revolutionary America, 1787, whenever the Constitution was done and the ratification began. This is from Federalist 46, and I am pretty sure I've read this before, but it seriously makes a great point and just completely destroys this argument this guy's trying to make. In Federalist 46, James Madison writes the following: "Let a regular army fully equal to the resources of the country be formed, and let it be entirely at the devotion of the federal government. Still, it would not be going too far to say that the state governments, with the people on their side, would be able to repel the danger. The highest number to which, according to the best computation, a standing army can be carried in any country, does not exceed 1/100th part of the whole number of souls," that's 1%, "or 1/25th part of the number able to bear arms. This proportion would not yield in the United States an army of more than 25 or 30,000 men. To these would be opposed a militia amounting to 500,000 of citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men chosen from among themselves, fighting for their common liberties, and united and conducted by governments possessing their affections and confidence." So right here in this, James Madison is talking about how the right to bear arms is imperative for the preservation of liberty and to overthrow the newly formed federal government that he supported. And keep in mind, James Madison was also the author of the Bill of Rights in the first Congress just a few years later, including what became the Second Amendment. So James Madison had a very good understanding of what all of this meant. There was no loyalty pledge to the government of the United States. There was a loyalty pledge during the American Revolution because there was a frickin' war going on. But for everyday life, there is no loyalty pledge to the government of the United States because they can become just as tyrannical as the crown became in colonial America. And to say that the right of revolution is a serious misunderstanding of the role of the right to bear arms is bogus. So there it is. I'm 5 for 5 now. I have just destroyed an entire Salon.com piece because it's entertaining. Go home, Salon. You're drunk. You have no idea what you're talking about. Anyway, that's going to do it for me. I hope you really enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe and tune in next Sunday. Phil King will be here to talk about constitutional carry. And I will see you all then, Lone Star Gunners. Until then, arm yourself with knowledge and share the ammo.